So let me tell you a little bit about Chris McCarthy, okay? The talk that Chris is going to give us tonight is on the art of collecting. It'll give a brief history of collections, highlight some private and public and controversial collections, and also explore the building blocks for both personal and institutional collecting. So if you're an interested art collector or you know people who are, this is for you. Chris is the Chief Executive Officer of the Provincetown Art Association Museum, PAAM, which was established in 1914 by a group of artists and townspeople to build a permanent collection of works by artists of the Outer Cape and to show those works. So PAAM is over 100 years old. Encompassing over 3,000, more than 3,000 works from artists who have lived or worked on the Outer Cape. The collection is a burgeoning historical record of the original Provincetown art colony. And Chris is now overseeing the entire Provincetown Art Association Museum since 2001. She's responsible for all artistic, administrative, fiscal, and strategic decisions at PAAM, which is the largest presenter of Cape Cod art by a national, regional, and international artists. Since 1985, Chris has worked in numerous galleries and museums throughout New England, which have included the Hunt Cavanaugh Gallery at the Providence College, the Yale University Art Gallery in New Haven, Connecticut, the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse, New York, and the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston. So Chris received her BA from Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island, and her master's from Syracuse University. She was adjunct professor at Boston University's Metropolitan College and taught managing a visual arts organization for over 12 years. So I'd like you to welcome Chris McCarthy from Provincetown.
When I listen to that, I'm like, oh, I'm almost as old as, I've almost been there as long as PAAM. But thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Helen McNeil, too, who is really helpful with this, putting together this presentation. So essentially what I'm going to do is what Susan said. I'm going to talk about collecting. I'm going to talk about institutional collecting and how personal collecting can end up being beneficial to institutions. I'm going to talk about some private collections and which have become public. But really a collection, the way I look at it is that Provincetown is the oldest continuous art colony in America. And what that means is when Charles Hawthorne came to Provincetown in 1899 and opened up his Cape Cod School of Art, that school still continues today. So this is why, because Cape Ann will tell you that they have an older art colony than Provincetown, but we're the oldest continuous art colony, that's the word, which makes Provincetown, that's why it's so unique. But I look at PAAM's collection, and the earliest works we have are from the late 1800s all the way to the present. In 200 years from now, that collection is still going to not only preserve that legacy, but it's going to continue to tell the story of why artists came to Provincetown, what Nappy Van Derrick used to say, the way it used to was, and a lot of the paintings that he collected were of place, of what things used to look like. And it's a veritable record on so many levels of place, of purpose, and of the artists that were here and why. And so that's how I look at the collection. It's the heartbeat of the organization. And it's used in so many ways, educationally. Like right now, our collection is up. We have 60 works up at Cape Cod Hospital. We have 100 works up at Seashore Point. If you're doing your will at Lattanzi Spalding, you can look at 30 works there. We have works in the new Hopper exhibition that's opening in Gloucester this weekend, Hopper's Gloucester. We have works in that exhibition. So a collection is also about lending. It's about getting it out there, not having it in the basement. And a small museum, I think, almost has kind of an advantage because the Metropolitan Museum has so many works of art, they don't know what to do with them. We have close to 5,000 objects actually now in our collection. I know what to do with them. And so when people are thinking about leaving their collections to a museum, you have a museum that can be capable of not only handling it, but making sure that the work gets out there. And that's what we really try to do. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm also going to talk about the Highland House collection as well. I'll try not to keep focusing on PAAM, but because I've been there so long, it's kind of a habit. But anyways, what I'm going to do is go through a series of slides. And Susan kind of introduced my background. My real art historical background is in Italian Renaissance. Okay, so that's very useful in Provincetown. Not really. And so when I finished my master's at Syracuse, I got 2 masters at Syracuse, one in museum studies and one in Italian Renaissance, and I was ready to go, conquer the world. I didn't do that. I couldn't get a job anywhere, so I moved to Boston in 1994, and I got a job at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, the one on Boylston Street. That's the fire station one. There, yes. The ICA was doing a big exhibition of Elvis in Maryland, which they thought was going to be the biggest blockbuster on the planet. They had Maryland jump out of a plane over Fenway Park. They had billboards up in the T station, and they hired all these people at the ICA because they thought it was going to just be the biggest boom to their bottom line. It was an absolute bust. It was huge in the South and in Tennessee and Graceland and places like that, but Boston really wasn't the Elvis and Maryland fanfare. Maryland maybe, not so much Elvis. So I ended up getting a job. I was hired temporarily to run the front desk at the entrance of the ICA. That was my first job, and eventually I kind of moved my way around. And I worked in operations, I worked in education, I worked in curatorial, anywhere that they needed something, because this was what I wanted to do. And my big break was when the assistant to the director was leaving, and I was recommended to replace her. And I can tell you, if you ever want to know anything or find out any information, you call the assistant to the director, because they know everything. And so I learned how to fundraise. I learned about contemporary art, because again, my background was Italian Renaissance. I got to go to the Venice Biennale with my boss because she couldn't remember anyone's name, and I can. If you've ever seen the movie The Devil Wears Prada, where they're at that place and they can't remember the names, that was me. I was always in earshot. So I got to go to Art Basel, the one in Switzerland, not Miami, and I got this really incredible contemporary art 101 times 7 in the course of several months, because my boss was just incredible. She was from the Czech Republic and she was brilliant. So after she left, there was no director at the ICA for almost 2 years. That was 2000. That was 1999 to 2001, or maybe 98. I can't remember. But I was in the director's office. So what do? You learn how to do everything. And so the next step was, I guess, to be a director. I didn't know it was going to be here. Someone sent me the job description for PAAM, and it was about 8 pages long. You will do everything. You have no staff, and you're making no money. So it was like, who would do that? I was like, so I decided to apply so I could come to Provincetown for the weekend, because I had been coming as a visitor for probably about 10 years. So I got an interview. It was on Portuguese Festival weekend in 2001, and it was hotter than it is today. And I had a suit on. If you wear a suit in Provincetown, automatically people are suspicious that you're either selling something, that you clearly look out of place. And there was no air conditioning in the interview room, and the people who were interviewing me were in shorts and t-shirts, and I just took my jacket off, and I was like, I'm not taking this job anyways, so we'll just see where this goes. And Pat Schultz, who used to be the realtor in Provincetown, was in the front row, and she said to me, if you get this job, where are you going to live? I'm like, well, you're a realtor, you're going to find me a house. And she looked at me, and she had these big glasses, and she's like, I like you. And that was sort of the beginning of the beginning. And Ruth Hebert, whose father was the town doctor in Provincetown, he used to trade medical services for artwork. It was swapping services. And when I stayed at Ruth Hebert's house, and when I walked in, the first thing I saw was a giant Milton Avery. And I saw Jim Forsberg, and I saw these other paintings. I didn't know who a lot of these artists were, but I knew the artwork was good. And Ruth said that her father had amassed this collection by swapping services with artists. And that really resonates, because people did that all over the place. And that's how a lot of people got collections, was from swapping. And so I ended up staying with her for 3 nights. And I said, no matter what happens, if I don't get this job, meeting you has been such an eye-opener, because she really could talk. She talked to me about why Provincetown is so important as an art colony. And yes, there's Carnival and this, that, and the other thing, but really, why is the art history so important? So I went back to Boston. couldn't sleep. I got the job offer and I gave 2 weeks notice at the ICA. I was working on the $60 million capital campaign to build the new ICA, but I thought, what the hell, I'll get a water view sooner if I move to the Cape. So I did. But my boss was not happy with me, let's put it that way. And I think about it now, no one gives 2 weeks anymore. You have to give like 2 months. But I did it and I moved here. And it's actually, what's today, July 18th? I think July 14th was my first day 22 years ago at PAAM. I had no keys to the building because no one was there. I was late. There was a class in the driveway and no one was there to let us in. I went up to my office when I finally got in. I sat in my chair and it rolled across the floor. As you know, things are never, everything is lopsided, and I never looked back. And we continued to do a massive renovation and capital campaign. And one of the reasons we did that capital campaign and that renovation was to make sure that the art that was made in Provincetown and Truro and Wellfleet could stay here or come back here. Because at the time, when you don't have any climate control or security or air conditioning, people aren't going to leave you anything. And when we finally got the building finished and our big exhibition in '07 was Edwin Dickinson, we borrowed from the Met and MoMA and the San Francisco museums and the Whitney, and all that work was coming back. And so after a long, very controversial project where I wasn't the most popular person in Provincetown for a long time, it worked. And if you build it, they will come. In this instance, it did. And so we have now built, when I started, our collection at PAAM was 900 and now it's 5,000. And the bequests that are being gifted to PAAM are in the thousands of objects that will come to the museum. But how do you get from there to there? And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. That was my very roundabout introduction. So before we get to that, I just want to give you a little historical background. This is a really great quote from J. Paul Getty, the oil billionaire. He was famously miserly. He installed a payphone in his mansion in Surrey, England, to stop visitors from making long-distance calls. He refused to pay ransom for a kidnapped grandson for so long that the frustrated kidnapper sent Getty his grandson's ear in the mail. Yet he spent millions of dollars on art and millions more to build the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. He called himself an apparently incurable art collecting addict and noted that he had vowed to stop collecting several times, only to suffer massive relapses. Fearful of airplanes and too busy to take the time to sail to California from his adopted hometown of London, he never even visited the museum his money had filled. So there's a picture of the Getty there. I don't know if any of you have been there before, but it's quite impressive, and they do have quite an incredible collection. But the art addict is a real disease. So where do private collections come from? So some of the earliest go back to the cabinets of curiosity, or curio cabinets. And you can see there's a few images of these little cabinets that are filled with what we would probably call tchotchkes today. But most of them were beginning in the ancient world, in Europe, East Asia, the Middle Ages. And these were mostly royal collections that now, well, a lot of them went into public collections if there wasn't looting or that type of thing involved. But this is really some of the earliest, the middle image is probably one of the earliest I could find of looking at how collections started. Some of the tastes and habits of early collectors were metals, engravings, bronze statues, porcelain, and then eventually paintings and altarpieces and things like that. But a lot of them were to commemorate either a person, a patron, that type of thing, and a lot of them were commissioned. So here I can go back to my Italian Renaissance art history, but the altarpieces were really some of the trends that were in the 14th century Italy. Simone Martini, Giotto, and Niccolo Pisano, these were all commissioned by artists for a patron, which and in many instances led to actual museums that went from private to public unless they were in churches. So here's a couple of examples of some of the famous collections: the Borghese in Rome, the Orleans in Paris, which I actually think might be closed now, and then the Farnese in Rome, which were, the Borghese was actually a summer cottage, for lack of a better term, which turned into a museum, which is quite incredible. And what the other thing they do is they don't just show what they have in their collection, they bring other exhibitions in as well. So it's really, actually the Borghese is one of my favorites. It's really, really quite beautiful. In the United States, the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C., is really quite an extraordinary place. And what's nice about that is that Duncan Phillips actually came to Cape Cod in 1933 or 34, and he discovered Herman Merrill and Charles Hawthorne, and he discovered a bunch of Provincetown artists that were making art on Cape Cod and started collecting. The Phillips collection has an incredible body of Provincetown art, and we have borrowed numerous, that's the one right there, numerous pieces from the Phillips. And one of the shows I want to do in the future is I'd love to do a trade and send a show of ours down there and bring a show of theirs here. But there's a lot of connection with Cape Cod. But the Frick and the Morgan, those are great museums. When you go to New York, go to the small museum, the small-ish museums, because there's not a lot of people there. And you can look at a Caravaggio on the wall, because these were the private collectors that in turn gifted a lot to the major museums, but kept some in the smaller museums. So the Morgan and the Frick are two of my favorites as well. Looking at some of the more medium to bigger size museums, the Gardner Museum in Boston obviously has an impressive collection which can't be moved. Obviously some of them were moved, not by choice. The new wing that was built not too long ago shows rotating exhibitions, but the actual permanent collection stays exactly where it is under Isabella Stewart Gardner's mandate. The Perez Museum in Miami is a newer museum. That was the collection of Jorge Perez. They also do changing exhibitions and traveling exhibitions. But I would say that one of the most controversial collections is the Barnes collection that is now in Philadelphia. It started out in Marion, Pennsylvania with Dr. Barnes. The reason Dr. Barnes became so successful is that he invented the eye drops that babies would get when they were born to make sure you didn't get syphilis. And in turn, he went to Europe, especially France, and started buying paintings, Cézanne's, Gauguin's, Matisse's, and he would buy directly from some of the artist studios. But the will stated very, very directly that the art was supposed to stay in the building in Marion and never be moved. It traveled. I saw the collection in Toronto. It was never supposed to go to Toronto. It is now in Philadelphia. It was never supposed to go to Philadelphia, but after he passed away, he didn't have any heirs. And for me, a person who asks for things all the time, and a lot of them are bequests that are left in people's wills, staying true to and honoring what the donor intended is very, very important. They found a bunch of loopholes in Dr. Barnes's will, and a bunch of politicians and people who knew that they'd make a ton of money off this collection moved it to Philadelphia. There's a movie you can watch, and it's really very one-sided about how this shouldn't have happened, but it's an interesting film, and I used to show it in my class, and because we used to talk a lot about fundraising and bequests and that type of thing. But the idea is what they did is they placed all the artwork exactly like it was in Marion in Philadelphia, so they kind of thought that would be okay. But when you look at it ethically, it's really not okay. And I know that the neighbors who lived in Marion didn't like all the buses coming in, but Dr. Barnes's intention was to have mostly people who were interested in education and not tourists to come to this museum. But it's an interesting story, and if you want, there's lots of information if you're into that type of thing. But that's one of the things that I always grappled with because it wasn't what he intended, and it is a magnificent collection, and I think people should be able to see it, but they should see it on his terms. Then there are the stories of collections that have merged within other museums. So Robert Lehman, for example, had an incredible townhouse in New York City that had a collection, and on his deathbed, the Thomas Hoving, who was the director of the Metropolitan Museum at the time, essentially had him sign over his collection with the understanding that they would recreate his townhouse at the Met and hang everything exactly the way it was. So the Lehman wing at the Metropolitan is a mock of his residence, and that's the reason they were able to get it there. Freer Gallery, again, another another collection that was merged into the Smithsonian. This is kind of a great, oh wait, where did I go? Oh wait, this first. Peggy Guggenheim in the Guggenheim Museum, this is such a great quote. She was also a self-described art addict who sought to distinguish herself from her business-oriented relatives and make her mark on the world through collecting and traveling in avant-garde circles. Peggy's collections, galleries, and museums were all stamped with her distinct tastes and styles. And the Guggenheim in Venice is just unbelievably beautiful. And her mark on the collecting world was pretty major. I'm just going to backtrack. These are three famous contemporary couples. The couple on the left are Herb and Dorothy Vogel. Herb and Dorothy collected 4,782 works of art during their life, and they lived in like a very small apartment in New York. He was a postman, and they bought only things that they could carry in a taxi cab. And so in 2008, they donated the 4,700 works were donated to the National Gallery in DC in 2008, and then they gave 2,500 more works to 50 museums in 50 states. Each got a piece of the collection, which is really, and they actually came to Provincetown. I met them a while back, but they came, and there's a video or a movie about them. Herb and Dorothy is what it's called, and it's great. The collectors up on the right are Thea and Ethan Wagner. They started collecting in the 80s, and in 2016, they donated 850 works to the Whitney and the Pompidou, and the reason they gave them all away so that they could keep collecting. So they gave them so that they could keep, and is kind of their cycle. Eli and Edith Broad down in the bottom. The Broad Museum is in California now because he originally was going to leave some of his collection to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and some, I think, to the National Gallery, and then he decided, I'm not leaving them anywhere because I don't want them to be in the basement, so I'm building my own museum. And to date, they have about 2,000 works by 200 artists that are part of the Broad Museum that get rotated all the time. So that's another option for people who have that kind of wealth to build your own museum. But it's also why museums need collectors, because this type of collecting becomes available to the public and it's not in a warehouse or that type of situation. My newest discovery is the Glenstone Museum. This is in Potomac, Maryland, and I was in Maryland earlier this year for my niece's wedding, and Glenstone was built in 2018, opened in 2019, and then COVID hit. So essentially, it's like you're driving through someone's neighborhood, and then it's this sprawling campus of these buildings, and there's a water feature in them, but then you walk a 2-mile loop and you see installations of contemporary art. But the beautiful part of Glenstone is that each gallery has one piece in it, not 50. The minimalism is just unbelievable. I've been back twice since, but it's really an extraordinary place, and it was Mitch's collection, and his wife Emily is a curator, and so she curates, but they do a lot of changing exhibitions there, but it's really an incredible place that you would never even imagine driving into this residential neighborhood and seeing this place. So I still have a lot of my roots in contemporary art, and I like to go and visit different contemporary museums, but this one was really kind of a keeper for me. So let's think about collecting art. I get this question all the time. Well, what should I buy? Do you think I should buy this? And this is my standard answer. It's like living with someone. You have to wake up and look at it every day. If you decide you don't want to do that, then you shouldn't buy it. If you wake up the next day, you're still thinking about it, then you probably should buy it. But I get that all the time, and there's no magic formula to it unless you're buying for resale or buying to sell or building a specific type of collections. I've seen so many people that start up and they just buy all kinds of things, and then eventually, if they're serious collectors, they'll kind of merge into one style or genre and then kind of move the rest. But it all depends. So be true to your taste. That's number one. You should really conduct research and educate yourself. Auction is where a lot of people are buying art now. You can buy an online auction every single day. They still have live auctions. But learning from the pros, a lot of times Sotheby's and Christie's will open up their auction houses, and you can go in and look at what's on view, and they have knowledgeable people that you can talk to about it. But the one thing that I do tell people is if you do start to amass a collection, not only for insurance purposes, but if your intention is ever to give it, keep your receipts. Where did you get it? Provenance is very, very important. And what provenance essentially is from the time it left the artist, where did it go and how did it get to where it's going? And a lot of times when we get pieces in, they have stickers on the back that tell you where they've been exhibited, where they were bought, what galleries showed them. That's all part of provenance, but that's really, really, really important. And now you can find out a lot of information online, but I think about the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian, that's all digitized. You can find out anything about any artist. They have video recordings that you can listen to. You can actually go visit and make appointments to go find out. But research is really, with the digital age, has become much easier. But really keeping your collection documented is important because there are people, I used to have this, I don't know where it is, or that type of thing. but keeping a good record is very important. And then plan giving. Think about where you want your collection to go. That's the other #1 phone call we get. I have this big collection, my kids hate it, I don't know what to do with it. What should I do with it? Because I don't want it to end up at the dump. So there are, ways to hire people that can help catalog your collections, place in other museums, sell some of the works, but it's important to have a plan in place if you're going to build a collection. Then this is the other thing. I don't have any wall space. How am I going to put, I can't buy it. I don't have any wall space. There's always wall space. But hanging something in your house is actually an important thing to know, because some people just bang a nail in the wall and there it goes. I guess if it's a small picture, that's one thing. But if it's a big picture and it weighs a lot, you have to think about what kind of walls you have. Do you have any kind of reinforcement behind them? So 9 times out of 10, it would make sense to actually find somebody who's going to help you hang something in your house. The other thing is, hanging art in a house is much different than it is in a museum. Because remember, if someone's sitting on your couch and they have their red wine and they do this, not good. So people ask me, will you help me hang my house? And I'm like, put your furniture in place first. Where do you want your furniture to be? And then we can talk about it. If you have a working wood fireplace, don't put a painting above it, because the creosote that comes up is dirty and it gets on your painting. Don't put paintings in the or works on paper in the bathroom near the shower, because the steam will ruin your work. So there's a lot of tips like that too. But installing artwork in your house, I mean, me, myself, I just throw it up on the wall. But I would tell people who are seriously collecting, think about not only how to do it, but what lighting does your artwork look best? Lighting is important. How much artwork weighs, just what I was saying, the right form of hanging. What about sculpture? Where do you want your sculptures? And the thing about sculpture is, if you have a sculpture in your house, this is a true story. One of my board members at the ICA had a Giacometti sculpture in her house. She had 3 golden retrievers with tails like this that would whack the sculpture, and all their fur would fall on the base. And I would come in and be like horrified, and she'd be like, oh, it's okay. And I'm like, no, what is it? And the dogs would just, they had a whole total run of this house, but when the tails would hit the skinny legs of that sculpture, I would die. Anyways, sculpture is something you should be able to walk around, but you also have to be careful in your house that, someone's not running into it as well. So if you are buying work for your house, think carefully about how you hang it, where you hang it, and who's going to help you. This is actually an installation shot of a collection show we have up at PAAM right now. It ranges from Charles Hawthorne, the big boat steerer, which is all the way in the back, Hopper to Frankenthaler to Motherwell. And this is a show that during COVID, I actually went to work every single day for 3 months when everyone was working from home. And I would start making up shows because I was rummaging through the collections, because I was there by myself, and it was actually really fun. So this was a show that I said, if you came to Provincetown and you were going to paint something, like, what's the first thing you'd see? And so some people painted Pilgrim Lake, the moors, the bay, a fisherman, a fish, a net, that kind of thing. So that's basically the premise of what this show is, but it also is a lot of the heavy hitters in our collection. And when people come to PAAM, they ask, where are your Hoppers? Where's your Hoffman? Where's your Motherwell? Where's your Frankenthaler? Well, they're all in this gallery right now, I can tell you that. It's a beautiful exhibition. And I really love curating out of the collection, because again, it's this record of who was here. All of these artists were looking at the same thing when they came to Provincetown. They all looked at the bay. They all looked at Pilgrim Lake. They all looked at the moors. But what did they make in response to it? And I think that when young artists come to the Cape today, they're looking at the same thing these artists looked at. And I think it's just so important for this legacy to continue. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about conservation, and I'm going to use some really extreme examples. If you have collections like PAAM's and like the Highland House, these collections are very manageable in conservation. But what about Ann Hamilton's lettuce heads with snails on them? Okay, this was purchased by the Hirshhorn. It's 2 cabbages and 20 snails. In 1989, the Hirshhorn purchased this piece. Well, you know what's going to happen. The snails are going to eat the cabbage, right? And then the snails will eventually die. So they replace them. They replace the cabbage and they replace the snails. But is it the original piece? Is it another piece? So these are the questions you ask yourself. Cornelia Parker's Hanging Fire on the right, which I've worked with her before. She's an incredible artist, but these are all pieces of a structure that was burned in a fire. and they're suspended by fishing wire from the littlest tiny charred pieces to the bigger. Those will eventually disintegrate, even though she shellacked some of the pieces and put kind of a protective coating. But how do you store that? It's very difficult to store a piece like this. How often are you going to show it? But what's going to happen when the pieces start to disintegrate? So these are questions that contemporary museums have to ask themselves when they're thinking about collecting works like this. Janine and Tony, the left is chocolate, the right is soap. So it's called lick and lather. So eventually, if it's not in the right climate, they're both going to melt. But so you have to make sure that the conditions, if you're collecting work like this, are proper. Because if anything is in the sun or direct light or anything, that would be the end of that. And then Jana Sturbach's flesh dress, that's a dress actually made out of meat. And eventually, meat's going to go bad. Even though it's cured, it's going to go bad. And on the right is a big video installation by Bill Viola. And I think that digital art really is the one that gets questioned the most, because if this was made in a certain format, you know that every 5 minutes digital changes. So if you watch this on a DVD and then DVD players become obsolete and you can watch it in another format, is it the same piece of artwork? So these are the questions that contemporary art museums and conservators ask themselves all the time, and then people even ask, is it really art? Yes. The shark, the Damien Hirst shark, is in formaldehyde. That's a really famous piece, but I know they've already replaced the shark, so is it the same piece? And the best is the Robert Gober donuts. So those donuts were treated with a chemical so that they wouldn't rot, and somebody walked in the museum and ate one and ended up in the hospital. I would imagine there was signage, but you know that people don't read. So here are some really just extreme examples of conservation issues that more contemporary museums have to worry about. Thankfully for me, I worry about cleaning paintings, reframing, restretching, works on paper. That kind of stuff, been there, done it, glad I don't do it anymore. But food for thought. And here's some really good resources if you're thinking about collecting. The Center for the History of Collecting is part of the Frick. Like I said, the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian is a fantastic resource. All of the, like Ask Art, the ones online now, you can find so much about artists and sales and information. You have to be careful because not all of it is correct, because a lot of people can post these things, but there are a lot of resources out there to do research. But when I worked at Yale, my job was, here are a pile of artworks we know nothing about, find out something about them. That was really kind of fun, because when you work at a place like Yale, the resources are pretty fantastic. But is there a stamp? Is there a mark? And you learn a lot about that type of sleuthing and figuring out about art. But a lot of times, if you do find something, chances are there's going to be somebody that can help you figure out where it's from or what it means. And so how do museums build collections? So first of all, you're making sure that the artwork is true to the mission. So PAAM's mission is artwork from the Cape and the Islands. Doesn't mean you have to live here. Like Lee Krasner was in Provincetown for 2 summers to study with Hans Hoffer. She counts. If someone gave us a Monet, we could take it unrestricted and sell it. Wouldn't that be nice? I'd never have to fundraise again. But it could never go into our permanent collection, because our permanent collection has a specific mandate of artists from the Cape and the Islands. But it doesn't mean you have to live here. You can definitely breeze through, and that counts too. We have a collections committee and a very tight collections management policy, so that when things come into our collection, we look at what do we already have by this artist, what don't we have, what are the gaps, what's the condition. Like, we have a sergeant in our collection, and it's like, when I first started, where's the sergeant? Well, where the face is, it's cut out. Like, I could fit my face in there. So it can't be, it's beyond repair. So I'm like, well, why do you still have this? They're like, because it's a sergeant. I'm like, okay. Well, anyway, so if anybody has another sergeant they'd like to give us, let me know, because we don't have a good one. But anyways, thinking about conservation and condition is very important. Your collections management policy dictates, like, if we have 20 of this, like Nappy, we have 250 of Nappy's pieces. But Nappy would buy the same etching. He had 10 of the same etching. And you're like, Nappy, why didn't you buy this? Oh, I forgot I had it. So if we wouldn't have 10 of the same etching. We would have 1 or 2, like that type of thing. Buying at auction. A lot of times we have purchased some things for our collection at auction. I've asked other people to purchase things at auction and gift them to us. We do a big auction every September of deceased Provincetown artists. A lot of that artwork has come back to PAM because we have a record of where it all goes. People get tax deductions for gifting artwork. There are definitely very strict IRS rules, but if your gift is $5,000 or over and you get an independent appraisal and we fill out a Form 8283, you get a tax deduction. But the thing to remember is, if someone has gifted you something and they get the tax deduction, and then say we decided we were going to de-access it, which means you're getting rid of it out of your collection, you can't give it back to them. They have to buy it back to you because they already got the deduction on it. So there's all kinds of these. This is why you have a good attorney and a good tax accountant, because those are not my areas at all. But I do know them. We have a program at PAM called Adopt an Artwork. So say that this Lucy Longo was gifted to us and it had like a big tear in it. Even though it was gifted by Nappy, Susan Kurtzman could say, I want to pay for the adoption of that painting. I'm going to pay for the cleaning of it. It would say gift of Nappy Van Derrick, adopted by Susan Kurtzman. So your name stays in perpetuity. And that's the way we've gotten people to help us with conservation costs, because we don't have a conservator on site. We use outside conservators, but it's very, very expensive. We're about to do an assessment on our collection, in fact, to think about what things really need some work, new frames or cleaning, that type of thing, but it's a whole process. But it's a really expensive process. So to get people to help in that way, like if it costs $750 to clean a painting, someone could donate that money and you could have the painting cleaned and put their name on it. So that's something that we do. Storage, always the number one problem. That was the number one reason why PAM decided to do the expansion and renovation, not because it was raining inside the building when it rained outside. That was important too. But the idea is that we didn't have enough storage, people weren't leaving work to us, and the collections committee wasn't taking work because it was too big. That's not a reason to not take artwork. And so when we made the decision to do this renovation, it was with the intention that storage was going to be a big piece of it. So we have 4,500 square feet of storage on site, and we have 4 big warehouse bays in Truro. And eventually what's going to happen in Provincetown, that storm we had in December, for the first time ever, water came over Angel Foods and hit the second floor at PAM. That's never happened before. Pretty soon, PAM is going to be the waterfront property, and our collection is going to have to leave that and go somewhere else. So that's probably not in my lifetime, but it's going to happen. And so it's something that I think about all the time. So thinking about moving our collection off-site is something that we very much need to think about. So when the new ICA was being redesigned on the waterfront in Boston, with that cantilevered overhang where there was no storage because you're basically in the water. So they had to think about off-site storage when they decided to become a collecting museum. And it's so convenient to have our collection on site right now because I could just go downstairs and grab something. When collections are not convenient, you have to really plan on when you're going to get them and how you're going to get them. Permanent collection versus unrestricted gifts. So we were gifted the estate of William Fried and Lillian Orlowski, 2 artists that studied with Hans Hoffman. When we were gifted this estate, it's thousands of artworks, things on napkins, things on shingles, things on any surface you could imagine. So what we did is we accessed what we thought were the best works into the permanent collection, and now we have the option to sell what's unrestricted. And so we can sell the work, but there was a condition of that gift that the money goes back into conserving some of the existing work, and we also give out scholarships through it. So when anybody asks us that we want to give something to the collection or to the museum, my first question is it for the permanent collection or is it an unrestricted gift that we can do anything we want with? Some people are like, do whatever you want with it, whatever works best for the museum. Some people are like, I want it in the collection and I never want it to leave. So there is a deed of gift that you actually fill out that says this is part of the permanent collection and it will never be sold or de-accessioned. And de-accessioning is a very tricky conversation in itself because back in the 70s, apparently, someone at PAM sold Charles Hawthorne painting to pay for the electric bills and bills. Big no-no. When you sell artwork when you de-accession something out of a collection, it can only be used to either purchase another piece of artwork for the collection or conservation. So my first week at PAM, after I was locked out of the building, someone screamed at me for selling the Hawthorne painting in 1972. How dare you? I'm like, Well, I was born in 1967, so it really wasn't me that did it, but don't worry, we won't sell any more Hawthorns, I promise. So that's a really key thing about thinking about building a collection in a museum. Is it a permanent collection piece or is it unrestricted? And a lot of times we love an unrestricted gift because we can determine whether or not we want it in the collection, and if not, we can sell it and use the money. If it's an unrestricted gift, you can use the money for anything, and that, of course, helps all of us a lot. So why should collectors gift to museums? Well, there's the obvious, tax deduction. But basically, I have barely an acquisition budget. I think our acquisition budget is so small that I essentially ask people to buy things, or don't ever invite me to your house because I'll go to the bathroom 10 times, see what you have, and then forget it. I'll ask you to borrow it and you'll never get it back. But we all have, small museums have limited acquisition budgets, would prevent us from competing. Like, what if there was a Hans Hofmann, at auction recently that went for like a couple $1 million. We couldn't buy that. But somebody else could buy that, and you hope the intent is that they would eventually donate it, but some do, some don't. Major collection gifts can broaden a museum's offerings and attract new audiences. So when we did the Helen Frankenthaler show in 2018, that was the biggest attendance we have ever gotten at PAAM for an exhibition. In turn, we were just gifted 5 Helen Frankenthalers to our collection. We didn't have any. Now we have 5. The Hopper collection at PAAM, we had one Josephine Hopper painting of California when I started at PAAM, and people would be like, "Where's your Hopper?" I'm like, "Oh, we have a Joe Hopper of California," and you can imagine the response to that. Fast forward to 2014, which was our centennial, we got 2 drawings, a male nude and a female nude by Edward Hopper. People were still not impressed, not at all. But then in 2016, we acquired a collection of Hopper's, over 200 drawings, diaries, letters, ephemera, and now we have the 2nd largest collection of Hopper in the world to the Whitney. So that changes your museum a lot. I never got more phone calls in my life about our Hoppers. And now everyone is like, "Where are the Hoppers? Where are the Hoppers? Where are the Hoppers?" There are some right now. In fact, when we got the gift, we had the entire collection up, and I got a call from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. They were doing a big exhibition called Hopper in the American Hotel Room. "Hi, can you send us images of everything in your collection?" "Nope, I don't have a picture of anything. You want to come, you get on a plane and you come here." So 2 curators came in March of 2017, and there were 9 drawings in that collection that were studies for paintings that were in that exhibition that they didn't even know existed. The other thing is that Joe Hopper's diaries, which are incredible, when they took their cross-country trips, she wrote descriptions of all the hotel rooms. So they had actual descriptions of the paintings of the hotel rooms. So our collection immensely boosted the information and preparatory thinking on the Hoppers that were in that show. So it becomes a really important study collection. The whole thing is digitized now. You can read the diaries, you can look at all of it. But up until that point, up until like 2 years ago, it wasn't. And so it's really important that our collections are, and that collection was owned by the Schiffenhaus family, who owned the Hopper House in Truro. So when they approached us they didn't gift that collection, we bought that collection. We got it on sale, I can tell you that much, but we bought it. And the reason being is they wanted the collection to stay together, and they wanted to stay on the Cape. They did not want it to go to the Whitney. Josephine Hopper's will said that all the artwork goes to the Whitney, the Nyack House becomes a museum, and the Truro House and its contents go to Mary Schiffenhaus. Well, because it said its contents, the drawings and all the artwork that was in the house got to stay with the family, and it didn't go to the Whitney. So we purchased that collection, and now we have the 2nd largest collection of Hoppers. And that's why collectors should give to museums, because that changed PAAM in so many ways on such more on an academic and research level. We are included in anything Hopper that comes out now. Films, videos, books, exhibitions. The big show that's opening in Gloucester, we're in the catalog, we're in the exhibition. I get invited to every Hopper thing under the sun. I got to go to the Whitney's VIP opening of the Hoppers New York, because we were a program partner. And so that Hopper collection really helped PAAM in ways that were unimaginable to me. So again, artworks that are specific to place help preserve and enhance legacies. That's a really key point. Some of the challenges. So new generations of collectors. There are a lot of new generations that don't collect. They have digital things. They don't have physical pieces of art. there are tax-free zones in different parts of the world. Geneva, Singapore, Asia, Wilmington, Delaware. Those are tax-free zones where you can keep taxable items in warehouses so you don't get taxed on them. But it doesn't mean that they're going to go anywhere. They stay. You can borrow them, but only for short periods of time. Some collectors aren't in a hurry to dispose of their art, or they create their own places for the donations. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. But I will tell you, in my opinion, collecting is about building relationships with the people who own the pieces and them getting to know your organization, why it's important. Why is it important that these Truro pieces are in Truro? Because they're in Truro, because they're of Truro. These pictures, and we pulled a few from the Highland collection that gratefully Diana Worthington and Nappy and other major collectors who were generous enough to give these, because these speak directly to the mission and the legacy of this museum. So here's the mission of the Highland House. Inspire all people to explore, discover, and experience the rich heritage of Truro and the Outer Cape from valued artifacts, living history exhibits, and ongoing community interactions that emphasize their influence on society today. And that is exactly what this collection does. And this piece, this double-sided Joe Hopper's, is just absolutely beautiful. Joe Hopper's work is really, really important in the grand scheme of Hopper and Mr. and Mrs. Hopper. She talks about how she taught him watercolor, that he learned watercolor from her. Their styles are very different. You definitely can see some resemblances when you look at an image that he did side by side. A lot of times you will see blue outlines on her houses and structures. There are things that definitely delineate them, but this is a really important picture, and it's important that it's here because it's of Truro. And Hopper really had nothing to do with PAAM at all. In fact, the only thing I could find in the diaries was there was a passage where someone said, the Art Association is having a juried show. Are you going to submit something? And his answer was, why would I? But anyway, he had a home in Truro. This museum, not that I'm giving you any of our Hoppers, but you can certainly borrow some. But the idea that this is in this collection is really, really important. And it's a record of their life here from 1930 to 1967, which is a big chunk of time. And it's where he made so many of the drawings that went on to be those famous paintings. And where she would paint 5 and 6 watercolors in a day, because she writes about it. I made 6, he made none. You should read them, they're very interesting. But this is a double-sided watercolor. It's really, really an important piece. Joe Hopper is going to get her due. There are scholars that are working on books and exhibitions, and we'll definitely do an exhibition of hers as well. But she was so important not only for his career, but in the grand scheme of American art history, their place was really, really key, and hers in particular. When you look at an artist like George Yater, which is this picture here, George Yater's watercolors are probably some of the most, they're exquisite. If you've ever painted with watercolor before, it's really, really hard because you can't control it. Like an oil painting, if you kind of mess up, you can fix it. But not with a watercolor, but look at the way, the mass, the houses, the way that he's able to paint watercolor is just exquisite. And look at this picture. It's something you probably all know if you live in Truro. But I think it's not only a record of place, but also a very important artist that came here. And so many of these artists came from other places. A lot of these artists came to study with Charles Hawthorne, and then Yater went on to be the director of the Provincetown Art Association for many, many years. Lucy Longle and her husband, William Longle, there's these two, the Clammers. And Lucy Longle's paintings they're just delicious. Like, you just want to walk into her painting, and who wants to walk up a hill, but I wouldn't want her paintings. But her depictions were very distinct. This kind of darker outline that she uses, and the little church on the hill, the little house on the hill. These are fabulous paintings, and they were a very big part of Truro history. And having Lucy and William Longle in your collection is really, really key. So I did have Lucy, and now this is Bill Evall. This is the little white line woodblock print there. So the white line woodblock print was perfected in Provincetown in 1915. It's a technique where you're taking a single block of wood, carving your image into it, but you have to carve it backwards. So only some brains can work like that. And then you're basically inking pieces of the block, and then you register a piece of paper on it, and when you pull it off, you get the print. And the white line is the actual carving inside the wood. So that technique went from a multi-block process to a single block process. And if you can get to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston before October, there's a beautiful exhibition of white line woodblock prints that were just donated to the Museum of Fine Arts from a collector in New York, Leslie Garfield, who also was very generous to PAAM as well. But those prints are really hard to find. There are not a lot of them out there, but they're very specific to this area. And Bill Evall went on to continue that process. Bill Evall lives in Truro. Bill Evall is a master printmaker, and the fact that that tradition still continues today is really, really important. Here's the Joe Hopper again. There's a bigger view of that beautiful hill. And I'm going to stop here, but just let me point out the Milton Wright. Susan Kurtzman, who you all know, go to her gallery and see the Milton Wright she has, because they're terrific. They're Wellfleet, they're Truro, they're Provincetown, but talk about an artist who painted place and really captured the moment, like he's the way it used to was. Like he captured a moment in time of these hills, the trees, the bay, you know, the harbor. Incredible painter. And Susan, you've done an amazing job showcasing these works. In fact, Pam just took 3 into our collection today. So go see those, because you should have those in your collection too. But I'll take questions now, and if there's any specific questions about any of the paintings, this is called a mud head. It's interesting to me, the typical mud heads that we see are usually, it was someone sitting for a portrait and their face has no detail in it, and a lot of the models who were sitting were either Portuguese or tan, so their skin is darker. That's why they were called a mud head. But the fact that this girl has way more features and hair, it's very interesting that it's called a mud head. Even though her facial features aren't fleshed out, it's still called that. It's a really, really beautiful and lovely painting. And then, so we did pull some for some of you to look at as part of the permanent collection. And the Ross Moffat over there, Ross Moffat Skies. Some days I'm not walking my dog, I'm like, that's a Ross Moffat sky, that's a Ross Moffat dune. You become so immersed in these paintings that sometimes you actually see what the artist has done. We have an Edwin Dickinson up at PAAM right now of the pier in the fog from 1928. All this rain we've been having, if you walk down to the pier the other day, you would see that. You can see what the artist saw. And that to me is really, really exciting when I'm somewhere and all of a sudden I'm in Ross Moffat world or I'm in Garrett Benecker world. But the idea is that these artists were capturing a moment, and the fact that we, the organizations, have the responsibility to steward these collections is a really huge piece of what we do. But sharing them with the public is equally as important, and that's why going to museums is good, but also taking note of what a collection has and what they don't have. Like people always ask me, what don't you have in your collection? And I'm really greedy when it comes to our collection. Well, we don't have a Mark Rothko. Mark Rothko had a house in Provincetown. He lived next door to Tony Vevers and Herman Merrill, or Tony Vevers bought his house. We should have a Rothko in our collection. Can we afford a Rothko? God, no. But would someone get us to work on paper? Yes, and I will get one of those. That's like one of my conquests coming up when I have enough energy. But it's too hot, so I don't right now. So anyways, but that's kind of my thinking. And again, I can just sit here and ramble, so I'm going to stop myself and open it up for questions.
So the mud one, would they ever fill the faces in, or was that the intention to leave it?
Usually the student drawings, like the studies, were mud heads, and then they would go on to be developed into a portrait. In Provincetown, there was a house that 2 friends actually bought, and when they gutted the house, the insulation was mud heads. So we have some of those, and they have screw marks through them, and they were used, because a lot of them were painted on board, and they were used as insulation within the walls. Yeah.
Were they signed, Chris?
No, many of them were not signed, no. And a lot of them were either in the Hawthorne class or a Henchy class. It's very typical of that school. Yeah. But I mean, because, usually a lot of them had this very brown tone to them, so they could have come up with a better name than mud, but it is what it is.
Do you know the painter?
Yes, this is Helen Sawyer, and there's some fabulous Helen Sawyers out in your lobby too. But this is really, it's a lovely painting, but I was when I first saw it, I'm like, this isn't a mud head, this is like a little girl, but then it's Helen Sawyer, but she studied with Hawthorne, and the fact that the face isn't fully distinguished.
So this is complete though?
Yeah.
This is her finished work?
I mean, I would say so because she signed it. Yeah.
Jerry Farnsworth had a school
Yes,
here.
he
So
did.
is that connected at all with the Provincetown School, or are there Farnsworths in the Provincetown Club?
Yes, we have Farnsworths and Sawyers in our collection. There were actually, by 1906, there were 5 schools of art. Ambrose Webster had a school, which was directly across the street from PAAM, where the flagship restaurant used to be. That was Ambrose Webster's school. So he had a school of art. Hawthorne had a school of art. Jerry Farnsworth and Helen Sawyer had a school of art. Lucy and William Longle and I think Nordfelt had a school of art. And they talk about how no one signed up for their classes and they were glad because they could just sit and make their own art. They didn't really care. So that we did, during our centennial, we actually did an exhibition that traced all of the schools. And then obviously Hoffman came in and started his school in 1935. But the idea of, and there's the North Truro School too. Yeah, which is still very much intact. It's a very cool place. But the part about painting in plein air, which is painting out of doors, which a lot of these artists did, if you were in the front, if you were the model, and a lot of the models were unclothed, if you were in the front row, your job was to keep the mosquitoes off the poor model. Could you imagine in the heat? No, I couldn't. But there's a big Great Time magazine spread of the Hawthorne barn with the model and all the students painting, and it's brilliant actually, and I think we do have a copy of that. But yeah, so the schools were really key, and I'd say really the 2 major schools were Hawthorne and Hoffman, where the legacy still continues, but there were a lot of other little schools. And I will tell you this, Charles Hawthorne didn't open the first school of art in Provincetown. A woman named Dewing Woodward came to Provincetown in 1896, and she opened a school of art, but it only lasted 1 summer. And so she gets no credit whatsoever. And she was discovered probably about 10 years ago. A family member found some stuff and gave us a call and came. So we have a drawing actually from 1896, but she's not credited at all because the school didn't continue. So now forever and ever, whenever I do a lecture on Provincetown art history, Hawthorne may be, titled the founder of the art colony, but he is not the founder of the first art school in Provincetown. And who knows if there was even one before her. And that's the interesting thing, is that you continue to learn things when people clean out their basements or their attics, or a house passes from a generational family to another. I mean, do you know the Murchison house, which is that glass house on the hill right across from the Red Inn? So that was Carl Murchison and his wife, who were very generous to PAAM. They gifted a lot of artwork. But after they passed away, it kind of went down. There was one living relative. She passed away, and the executor was this woman from Florida who knew zero about everything. She called me and she said, "Oh, I'm the executor, and there's some artwork here, and I don't know anything what to do with it." I'm like, "I will be there in 5 minutes." I went there, and the interesting thing about that property is when you have a glass house, you don't have a lot of walls. But there was a halfway house, and there was another house at the bottom of the hill. He was a psychotherapist, and he wrote tons of books. So the middle house had just tons of books. But these paintings that were shoved in the rafters of this building, there had also been a fire there, so a bunch of them had been kind of tarnished, but not badly. So we took the collection out of the building. It took 8 years before the estate settled, but there's no way I was giving those paintings back. I just wasn't. And we were able to get people to adopt them and clean them, and they're phenomenal, because the Murchisons were major collectors and patrons who helped support a lot of living artists at the time. So that legacy of the Murchison collection is really, really important. And I got to go in the house, and of course, Snoopy, me, there was a little cupboard that was square, and it was for all the moonshine. So there was a moonshine cupboard, there was a mink coat cupboard, no mink coats though. And he was a ham radio operator, so there's a ham radio office with all of his equipment and stuff. But the architects, Gropius and his school, did that house with all the blueprints are there. It could be a museum in itself, but the thing about a modernist house that's so cool is that it looks like a wall, but then something pulls out of the wall, like a bar or something, and then it goes back in. So everything has a feature or a function, except there's no wall space. So we were able to walk with that collection, which was really huge. And then getting Nappy's collection. I mean, it took me 20 years to convince Nappy that I had first graduated from high school. Secondly, that I actually knew a little bit about art. He didn't really like anything past 1940. So when it came to exhibitions of abstract art, "Why are you showing that stuff?" I'm like, "Because I have to, Nappy, and I actually really like it." But when it came to the time for him to think about that collection and keeping it in Provincetown, that was what he really wanted. And I know he wants it out. So what I'm hoping to do is we still have it on extended loan. Is I'm gonna prepare a traveling exhibition and try to get 100 of those works to travel around the country with Nappy's story, because it's a fabulous one. And every time I curate out of that collection, I hear him on my shoulder, do you know what a wharf is? Do you know the significance of a wharf? And I'm like, no, Nappy, you tell me. I'm gonna tell you. And I knew that when I had gained his trust, is that we used to borrow from him all the time, is when he actually gave me the keys to the storage and told me I could go in myself. And then I was like, yes. See, patience is a virtue in some instances, especially for things like that. Yes, Helen.
Hi. I'm wondering if in your teaching or thinking about museum collecting, you've had occasion to think about the differences between a history museum and an art museum. I mean, looking at these museum and an art museum. I mean, looking at these landscapes that you selected, and I'm particularly pleased that Susan put the two cottages on hillsides here, almost in front of each other. They're painting the same landscape.
Right.
But the individual visions are drastically different in every way, both in form and use of color or whatever, so that they might almost be like abstractions based upon the same landscape. And one of the dilemmas that we need to face in terms of what to add to the permanent collection here is what about work that is not landscape or portrait? You know, Helen Sawyer did quite a few, you know, still lives or, you know, floral compositions. In later life, she painted abstract work. So have you addressed the question of, like, how far you go in collecting if you're not depicting a historical location or event?
Well, my answer is always leaning toward the yes, because she's the person who has the connection to the community, and it's still a piece of history, whether it's a landscape, an abstract, or a still life. And it's something, if she was created here, to me, it lends to the legacy and the history. And so if someone said to you, I want to know more about Helen Sawyer, well, we only have her landscapes, but she painted other stuff. But what about, you want to know more about Helen Sawyer? Look at the arc of her career. She painted still lifes, figurative, landscapes. Then you learn more about Helen Sawyer, the artist, who was here with a school in Truro. So, and again, you're talking to the wrong person, because I'm greedy, and I don't like turning things down when I believe that they fit the mission, because more and more what museums are doing now, when they have exhibitions of paintings, they're including things like this. So like if you go to an exhibition now, you're likely to see ephemera and drawings or photographs that personalize the artist, because artists were people. And I think when you have like artists like Motherwell and Frankenthaler and Hopper, people think of them in a way that they actually weren't actual people, but they were. So we're doing a Hartley drawing show in a couple of years, but we're borrowing like his pipe and some of his jewelry and his glasses and his sketch case, because those were all part of him. And I think it's important now, more important now, to have the object and the painting that speaks to it to give you a better understanding of who this person was. So my answer would be yes.
Very good point about contextualizing it. I just have one other
Sure.
very specific question. You spoke about deaccession.
Yes.
And saying that when you deaccession, you have to use the funds from the deaccession for conservation or other art.
Yes, you can't use them to pay the bills.
Right, so is that a law?
Well,
Or
it's
IRS rule?
it's the American Alliance of Museums, which is the national organization that is basically, if you're accredited, you're under that guise. They frown upon it, even though during COVID, they loosened some of the restrictions, but look at what happened at the Berkshire Museum. If you want to read about a real controversy, the Berkshire Museum sold their 2 Norman Rockwell paintings in lieu of a capital campaign to build like a science center. Norman Rockwell gave those, but because it was kind of a handshake deal and there wasn't anything in writing that said you can't ever sell those, they can never get those back. So now the Berkshire Museum has like a black mark like this, and it's going to be harder and harder for them to raise money. And it was the director at the time was a business person it was the quick way, the quick fix to raise money. The Norman Rockwell Museum is like down the street. Don't you think they would have wanted those for their museum? So I'm very old school when it comes to that kind of thing. So as long as I am the director of PAAM, nothing will ever be deaccessioned except to acquire or conserve. It would never be used to pay the bills because that's one of the museum mandates. And that's why you ask, is it restricted or unrestricted? Because if it's unrestricted, you can use your judgment to build funds or reserves and things like that. But that was a quick way out to raise millions of dollars instead of fundraising in the right way. And I think that, and I was actually deposed by Maura Healy, who was then the Attorney General, about the ethics behind that. And it was myself, Matthew Teitelbaum, who's the director of the MFA, and we were vehemently opposed. But there was a loophole because there was nothing in writing that said they couldn't sell those and that they were in perpetuity supposed to be for the permanent collection. So you have to do your due diligence when you're bringing things into the collection. And more, like those Frankenthalers, I signed my life away on that, meaning that those will stay in that collection until the end of time. They will never be disposed of, sold, or anything. And I believe in that because that, again, is protecting that legacy that's so important because 200 years from now, what's going to tell the story of the Provincetown Art Colony? Certainly not me, maybe my big mouth on a videotape, but it's going to be that collection. Susan.
I just have a question about valuation.
Yes.
Okay? So you buy a piece of artwork and, you know, the artist is lesser known at the time that you buy it and it's valued at this, but, you know, you wait 20 years and it's got, you know, he's or she has been collected over time and the valuation like changes. How do you do value? I mean, do you need to have somebody who's professional to do something like that? I mean, I hear all these stories about people going to the transfer station and finding a piece of artwork and then finding out later that it's worth, you know, a lot of money.
Museums, nonprofits by law cannot evaluate anything. So if you came to me and said, what is this worth? I could tell you, but I wouldn't tell you. You have to get an independent appraiser to do the appraisal. And it's hard because the auction market has really messed with valuating. So like, we had a William Freed that was probably sold for about $3,500. At one of our auctions, it went for $30,000. So you look at these auction records, and now the highest for William Freed is $30,000, and the lowest is $3,500. What's the valuation on it? Right. The other thing we can't do is authenticate. We can't authenticate artwork, even though I've seen fakes and a lot, and but at this point in time, I can tell the difference between a lot of fakes and a lot of not. But a lot of even foundations aren't authenticating anymore. But you have to get an outside independent appraisal to evaluate artwork for you. And an insurance appraisal is different. So we have insurance values when we lend work. Like I can put an insurance value on it, but it's not the fair market value of the piece. Yes.
I'm just wondering whether you have local artists who are alive now painting, whether there are some that you're following.
Yes.
I mean, like Robert Cardinal. Or,
yes. Yes, we have about 850 living artists that show at PAAM on an annual basis through our member exhibitions. But yeah, between our classes and just at an opening, we have a members open. There are 350, 400 people that come to those openings, and a lot of them are artists. And again, as long as I've been here, I see the cycle now. You get someone who moves here, they come to an opening, they take a class, they make something, they put it in a show, they might get picked up by a gallery, they may start teaching a class, then they give something for the collection. So it's full circle, and I've seen it. I've seen it with younger artists, I've seen it with older artists. But, and I think that being in a community like this, and believe me, I've juried shows all over, this community blows away, and I know I'm biased, but the artwork that's created here is exceptional. And it's hard for me to go curate or jury in other places because I want to pick like 5 things, because not that the work, I'm a technical juror, like I'm basing on technique when I'm jurying, sometimes subject matter, but there are a lot of things that with glitter and stuff like that that just, in my opinion, aren't worthy of being in an exhibition. But the artists that paint on Cape Cod have way beyond, they go way beyond, because you have the capability to talk to, interview, work with, study with artists that, like Bob Henry, who's going to be 90 this year, studied with Hans Hofmann. Bob Henry still teaches. He teaches at Castle Hill, he teaches at Falk, he teaches at PAAM. Paul Resica, who's going to be 95. Sal Del Deo is going to be 95. These artists are still willing to talk to anybody about their art, about the process, and I don't think a lot of communities have what we have in that respect, and that's why I think it's so important that younger artists know about the art colony, get immersed in it. You know, you're not going to get into every juried show. You're not, you know, you're going to have days where your paintings may not be what you want them to be, but that's all part of the process. And I think the support system here for artists is like no other, truly.
Do you think that's due to the, just the fact that it's the longest, the largest community, longest,
Yeah.
community? Is it the lights? Is it the,
Yes.
just the natural beauty?
Yes, all of the above, because remember, the National Seashore since 1960
Yeah.
has been the same, except for Mother Nature. So I tell people, go out into the dunes and look at what Joe Hopper painted, or look at what Ross Moffat painted, and you're looking at the same thing. However you decide to depict it is up to you, but the inspiration is still there. And when people say, what does artists mean by the light? I said, get in your car and come here and look like the winter light. When you see like the fires of Truro, when you look from Provincetown, that orange and yellow and pink, you can't describe that. You have to see it. And that's for me, like I'm a visual person. And when I drive around, in the dead of winter, if I'm clamming like this fabulous piece right here, you look around yourself. And first of all, you can't believe that you live here. I still can't believe I live here. And walking into Beech Forest after the first snow, you can't beat it. And I'm a city person. I like cranberry now. I go clamming, I go fishing. I love all this stuff. I can't imagine living in a big city again because I love the beauty that I can take in however I want. And I think that artists who have a gift or a talent or want to develop one, you have the best landscape imaginable that you can do it any way you want.
And then it just kind of snowballs.
Correct. Yeah. And when you have places like the Art Association, where you can pay $60 a year and show your work 4 or 5 times a year in a museum next to Frankenthalers and Hoppers and sell it, it's the best deal in town. Anybody else? Thank you. Oh, wait, I have. And give to the collection.